Hello my brethren, I hope you're all well. I'm going to attempt to tackle this issue of male abuse, and I give you a warning in advance that I'm not a psychologist. But I have been doing a lot of soul searching, and a lot of things have been coming up from my story in this journey as a man throughout these couple of months, especially since I started producing content. So rather than me making assumptions and generalizations, let's use myself as an example and do a retrospective study on me since my awakening, just to better understand what's going on here. That's usually a good way to start. I have said in yesterday's hangout that I'm a firstborn, so all of the pressure was on from the very beginning to be the backup father of my household. I had been pushed to be able to limit my wants and shamed from the very beginning for any girly attributes that I might have shared with any other females. Crying and begging for something were seen as a weakness very early on in my life, and repeated beatings from my father showed me that such behavior is unwanted in a man. The beatings continued for absolutely any reason that my father could have found. My sister's grades were not being good enough, my brother falling down and damaging his knee during football at school. You see, I wasn't looking out for them. That's why I was getting beaten. And that's where he instilled the idea of the protector very early on in my life. And it's not like we were discussing as if I was the most regular of boys. I was always the grade A in everything, 100% overall student without any effort that my father considered necessary in order to achieve those grades. And I was even beaten for being able to achieve those things without actually putting the effort for it. It was almost like envy or a competition that I was unknowingly involved with him, just to be the bigger alpha in the household. I learned early on in my life that physical pain is part of the life of a man. Up until recently, I felt like there was no psychological abuse, no psychological brainwashing that was taking place in my life. But I remember during those years, my father beating me and my mother telling me that men don't cry. Men stand strong, they stand their ground, they stand up to everyone around them. They are in control of their emotions and invariably their destinies. I was being coached to be an adversary to my father by my own mother, and my father, be it that he was much bigger than me, he was continuously putting me back in my place. So by having no way out from both an emotional and physical aspect in my life, it led me to completely shut down in absolutely everything. The physical pain aspect, I will say that I can take a lot of pain to get me moving and really worried about things. That which used to be uncomfortable is now unfelt, and the painful is now uncomfortable. With regards to the emotional aspects, I was completely shut down. It took years and a lot more time than everything else in order to understand that I was a little bit screwed up. It was a female in my life that first pointed out that I seemed to only either be ecstatic or completely indifferent and numb. When she questioned me about my feelings, I had no answer to give to her, because I did not recognize them and was forced from a young age to forget about them. Up to that point in time, I felt completely normal with my persona. I thought everyone was the same. When I became a young adult and I was able to rule my own destiny, I realized that I started to rebel. I was formed into this mold of a combination of my father and mother, and the mask simply did not fit on my face. It did not work. The one eye was looking left and the other one was looking right, and all I wanted to do was look straight ahead. And I was blindsided. I had sex with random girls. I argued with them to the point where I remember leaving one of my ex-girlfriends in the middle of the road in the highway and just fucking driving off. My anger had the best of me. It was the only emotion that I could grasp and understand out of all of the others. I got myself involved in fights that I knew I couldn't win just because, fuck it, right? I spoke too loudly and very painfully against people. I would play games with girls and boys alike. I even had this game where I would make a girl of my own age group or older cry in under half an hour, and I would actually time myself to see if I could do it. Until one of my ex-girlfriends at the time, despite the abuse, and I openly admit that it was an abusive relationship from my part, that one, because I was young and I had no idea what I was doing, she seemed to stick around and try to get very real with me. Then that female slowed the time down with her voice, which always reminded me of my own mother's voice. And I remember her telling me to calm down and listen to myself and try to understand my emotions and what was going on inside of me. She suggested books for me. She suggested research because she knew she could get me interested if I was to find the kind of thing intellectual. While that relationship seemed to end, and I thought initially that it was a caring and giving relationship on her part, the reality of the matter is that I now see things slightly differently. At the time, she also tried to instill on me attributes that she thought were her definition of what masculine was, just like my mother did. Due to the fact that there is no preconceived notion of what masculinity is, it seems to be that in order to be considered a man, you need to pass almost like a test, like a rite of passage into life. There is all these unwritten attributes that I need to have in order to comfortably call myself a man in the eyes of that specific woman. And what's worse, every woman, every society, every man has a different idea of what those ideas are. There is a test, an unwritten test in society that tests your emotional well-being, your physical well-being, and your intellectual well-being in order to be classified as a man. And then, according to those results, you're being stacked up and ranked alongside the rest of the men in society. And when that all is done and dusted, we all stand along this line of men where women just pass in front of us and take their pickings of the man that they want. That's what my life felt like afterwards. I was constantly shamed to get back in line because I was an outlier. I was constantly controlled by the people around me because I still managed to make it through of all the intellectual tests that they were getting thrown my way. I felt like an outcast almost. A guy that achieved things when people did not want him to succeed. The shaming was immeasurable from my family, from my friends, from society, because I dared to speak the things in other people's heads. Because I dared to expose what people consider to be the norm. I spoke against religion, I spoke against the concept of marriage, I spoke against the concept of traditional relationships from very early on in my life. I was an outlier, I have to admit that, yet hypergamy is undeniable for women, and I still continued being successful with the opposite sex, despite all those things, which fucking annoyed the living shit out of all the men that were continuously trying to put me back in line, and also the women who were less attractive than the women that I happened to have in my life at the time. Inside relationships, I still struggled with myself, being unable to understand which role I was supposed to fulfill. The fun guy who just pumps and dumps, the guy who is the guy that the woman initially met, or the guy who is a carer and a provider? Was I to be exciting and emotionally distant, or caring and emotionally close? I knew as a person that at any given day I would be a combination of all of those things, yet I was constantly being tested in my masculinity and my potential provision role, something that I believe is, there are two opposing ideas, because within the concept of masculinity, the alphaness, let's say, there is a danger within the man associated. The danger being that he might lash out, physically damage you, be physically assertive, and also protect you. He might actually enjoy his time with another woman or multitude of women, and he might not even stick around, whereas the provider is a completely contradicting idea to that. It's the idea that you will stick with the woman and help and provide for her well-being, which was an idea that I disagreed with in principle, because as far as I was concerned, I had no progeny, and I would never protect or provide any female, because I consider her well-being to be her job. So during my relationships, I always ended up protecting my masculinity and walking away to protect my identity as a person, and of course my ego, my sense of self, let's say. During all this time, you would also have the experiences from society and the people in that society that will constantly tell you that women are better than you. They're emotionally superior to you. Their emotional understanding is better. They're better parents than you. You should never raise your hand to hit a woman. There is never any reason to hit a woman. You should always protect the women around you and constantly trying to instill inside of you the ideas of being a white knight. While I have never been helped up to my feet by any woman ever in my life. Even in my darkest hours, the women that were involved in my life, I felt, that ingenuine concern in their voice. But their arguments, the arguments that they seem to be using in order to help me were not for a concern for me, but of concern for my future. What will happen if you don't get up and you don't help yourself up? You have exams. You don't want to be a doctor? You're not going to be a doctor if you don't get up. And no concern was ever shown over my own mental health, my own physical well-being. that was actually only addressed by other men when I had real conversations with them. And even from those men, at times I could hear the voice of a woman talking when they were actually speaking to me. I needed to pull myself up, not for my well-being, but for the well-being of my future family, the family that I might eventually create. And when all these things were happening, I realized that as a concept is not good enough. I was a person, for fuck's sake, and no one else defined me other than myself. And as I was about to conform to all the pressures thrown my way, as I was beaten down almost to a pulp, and I was ready to just walk back in line, I simply told everyone to fuck off, and I did what I knew how to do best. I walked away and tried to figure shit out on my own. You see, my brothers, even though we do not share a similar story, we all share a similar path from the home, whichever home it was that raised us, to the outside world after we become adults. And we all have a lot of pressures and a lot of contradicting ideas going on in our minds. The ideas that men receive are not caring or nurturing, but are seen as a way to put them back in line. They guilt trip us. They use ideas of nobility, pride to get us back in line. Every behavior that is unwanted is shamed or ridiculed, so to learn what is expected to be the social norm. And the abuse doesn't start simply in society, it starts from home. People do not raise all of their children in exactly the same way. After all, those children are expected to fulfill a role. The nurturing role is shown to the girls and the provision role is shown to the men. They are taught early on that they need to provide, even if they get no praise and no emotional affection as a result of what they provide. And they should still continue to provide without even complaining. And similarly, women are being pushed into that nurturing role, and a princess role at that, where she's learning from a young age to ask in order to be gratified in her wishes. Now, I'm not saying that all these things are strictly true for absolutely everyone, but this is an overall generalization that definitely applied in my family, and I'm sure it applies to a lot of other families from my experience in the field, let's say. There is an element of nature involved in all of these things, and as men, we learn to provide and care for our families. But in the past, those men used to get something out of it. Now it has reached the point where the men are competing, not just between each other, but also with other women in the social status ladder that they feel obliged to climb. And that status battle continues at home, in the bedroom, in life. And men are programmed to be amenable to shaming language and tactics, so that the challenges that females are throwing for power are actually causing them emotional distress. The distress is not that those men are feeling sad, so sad that they end up feeling suicidal as a result. The men simply don't know what they're feeling. The men don't know what is happening inside of them. The men feel worthless and guilty about all of their behaviors and blame all of their failures, even if they're not to be blamed at all, on themselves. And this is not lack of intelligence on their part, but rather a programmed response that has been instilled to them since childhood. The guilt and shame that young boys and young men feel in today's society is unlike any other. And where do these men turn for compassion? They turn to females, just like their programming told them to do. All your happiness, after all, would come from females. And what happens is that these females are not impressed by a man who's having emotional turmoil. They turn them away. They turn them down, which further increases those men's guilt. What's worse, my brothers, is that as men, we do not even recognize the abuse. It has been so continuous and inbuilt into the regular society that we do not even recognize it's actually happening. We do not understand it. We do not comprehend it. The emotional abuse for males starts from the day that they're born to the day that they die, and it is up to us to understand it. It is up to us to comprehend it, and it is up to us to reject it out of our lives, along with the idea of shame and guilt, because very few things are actually our fault. And as a man, I'm sure you recognize things that are actually your fault. But as a man, do you recognize the things that aren't your fault? Can you tell when you're blamed unjustifiably? And even if you do, how do you break away from the guilt that accusation on its own drags inside your heart? Thank you, my brothers. This was Nikuchowski talking about all things man. Please like, share, and of course subscribe to my channel for more updates.